each of these factors equal to 0. Square root of 2 secant x equals 2. Secant x equals 2 over the square root of 2 that you rationalize. So the secant of x is equal to 2 square root of 2 over 2, or just the square root of 2. Now, actually, probably would have been better if I just, the cosine now, I want the reciprocal of that. So 1 over the square root of 2, I'm getting the square root of 2 over 2. And I need the first quadrant, and I need the fourth quadrant, where cosine is positive. What angle has as its cosine the square root of 2 over 2? 45. So in the first quadrant, that would be pi over 4. And in the fourth quadrant, when you put that pi over 4 as a reference angle and subtract 8 pi over 4 minus pi over 4, you get 7 pi over 4. So if you start thinking in terms of radians and doing the math that way, it's much easier. Okay, let's take the next one. We have 2 sine x equals negative 1. Sine x equals negative 1/2. Now we know that the sine of 30, or pi over 6, is equal to positive 1/2, but we're not in those quadrants. We're not in first or second. We're in quadrant 3 and quadrant 4, because that's where sine is negative. So we have the pi over 6 in the third quadrant, and you're going to take pi, which is 6 pi over 6, plus pi over 6, and get 7 pi over 6. When you place pi over 6 in the fourth quadrant, you're going to go 12 pi over 6 minus pi over 6, which is 11 pi over 6. So we're getting 4 solutions. Pi over 4, 7 pi over 4, 7 pi over 6, and 11 pi over 6. We have 5 pi over 4. So the quadrants where the sine and cosine equal each other are both positive in the first. They're both negative in the third. So it would not only be pi over 4, but would also be 5 pi over 4. So now I have 3 sine squared over cosine squared equals 1. And now, if I multiply both sides by the reciprocal, and make a substitution, sine squared over cosine squared is tangent squared, x. So the tangent squared is equal to 1/3, but I want the tangent, so I'm going to take the square root of each side. So the tangent is equal to positive and negative square root of 1/3, which when we simplify that, we have the square root of 1, which is 1, over the square root of 3, that when I rationalize, I get the tangent of x is equal to positive and negative square root of 3 over 3. What angle has as its tangent the square root of 3 over 3? 30. So 30 is the same as pi over 6. And then we need to put that in each of the quadrants because it's positive and negative. So we have 6 pi over 6 minus pi over 6 is 5 pi over 6. In the third quadrant, I have 6 pi over 6 plus pi over 6 is 7 pi over 6. And in the fourth quadrant, 12 pi over 6 minus pi over 6 is 11 pi over 6. What I need to do now is to get everything in terms of one trig function so that I can work with it. And I do know a Pythagorean identity of sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. So I can make a substitution in place of cosine squared of 1 minus sine squared. And then I distribute the 2. 2 minus 2 sine squared x minus 3 sine x minus 3 equals 0. It's a quadratic equation. So now I have the quadratic term, negative 2 sine squared, the linear term, negative 3 sine x, and 2 minus 3 is negative 1. Now, before you factor, I want the coefficient of the quadratic term positive. So I'm going to multiply everything through by negative 1. So this is positive 2 sine squared plus 3 sine x plus 1 equals 0. And now I can factor. 2 sine x and sine x, and positive 1 and positive 1. I need to make them both positive so that the inside term is plus sine x, the outside term is plus 2 sine x, and I get a middle term of plus 3 sine x. Now I'm right back to the problems that we did earlier. I have 2 sine x plus 1 equals 0, and sine x plus 1 equals 0. 2 sine x equals negative 1, sine x equals negative 1/2, and sine x equals negative 1. Again, we already talked about looking at the sine graph. The sine is equal to negative 1 at 3 pi over 2. That's one answer. And the sine of 30 is equal to positive 1/2. That would be the first and second quadrant, but we have to go to the third quadrant and the fourth quadrant where sine is negative. So you're placing pi over 6 in the third quadrant and have pi over 6 plus 6 pi over 6 is 7 pi over 6. And in the fourth quadrant, 12 pi over 6 minus pi over 6 is 11 pi over 6.